From Southern Hospitality on Manhattan's Upper East Side, this is the New York Post Mets Status Report. I'm Mark Hale, and I'd like to bring in my teammate and friend Dan Martin. Does a great job covering the Mets for the Post. And Dan, yesterday we got introduced to the Mets' newest prospective, or probable, I should say, minority owner, David Einhorn. There was a conference call which you were on. Dan, what were your impressions of Einhorn on the call yesterday?
Well, it's interesting because the deal isn't finalized. He didn't get into too many specifics other than the fact that he's investing $200 million into the Mets. But he seemed pretty upfront in the fact that he was comfortable with the arrangement that the $200 million would not buy him any type of say in how the franchise is run. It also would not buy him any piece of the television station SNY, which a lot of people thought would need to be part of the deal in order for anyone to take on that type of investment. So he's a different type of guy. He obviously has a ton of money. He said several times that it was a personal investment, not an investment through his hedge fund. So it's hard to find out exactly what he gets out of this, other than the possibility, which he would not address, that if the Wilpons do have to sell more of the team, that perhaps he could be first in line to have a controlling interest.
Dan, you talked about what he might get. What about in terms of how this might affect the Mets next year, particularly with payroll going forward? Do you think this somehow allows them? I saw Sandy Alderson quoted saying, it's fair to say the payroll would be approximately $120 million, but he said we might have a new minority partner and things like that, and that could be a factor. Do you think that this new addition, assuming it goes through, do you think this affects the payroll going forward?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question and really unanswerable right now. I think it's certainly possible that it can, but it's still so early in what we know about Einhorn and the fact that the transaction hasn't even been completed yet. I think more interestingly, maybe not for 2012, but for down the road, I certainly think it helps them in terms of payroll. Whether they can use this influx of money directly towards next year's payroll, that's another question that remains to be seen.
We're talking with Dan Martin here, covering the Mets for the Post. And Dan, let's talk about Fred Wilpon's comments that he made in the New Yorker that came out earlier this week. We've heard from Jose Reyes, we've heard from Carlos Beltran in terms of their responses to Fred Wilpon's comments. We have not heard yet from David Wright beyond just a couple of sentences of statement. Probably he will speak this weekend, assuming he's at Citi Field. What do you think we hear from David Wright, and how curious are you to hear what his response is to all this?
I am pretty curious to hear what David has to say because, like you said, it was a pretty brief statement that he released, and it just basically addressed that Fred Wilpon was going through some hard times. So it was certainly not disrespectful or anything, but from a guy who has done nothing but play hard and also stood up for the ownership and for the team in the past, it was at least mildly curious to see that he took a little bit of a different tack, and that he's also remained fairly quiet in the days since then. Obviously, he's not been with the team. He was in California getting his back checked out, and then back in New York before the team got back from Chicago. So it's a little different circumstance. But, I mean, he's been the face of the franchise for 7 years, and this is the first time he was really called out. And I don't think his reaction is completely done yet. I think there's more for him to say. Whether he wants to say it or not is obviously up to him, and we'll see what happens.
See what happens this weekend at Citi Field. And also, let's talk one last thing about the Mets right now in terms of how they're playing. They lost yesterday in Chicago, so they've dropped now for their last 5 games. They've dropped their last 2 series. It looks like they will have Angel Pagan back in the lineup for this weekend against the Phillies. But how difficult is this series going to be against Philadelphia, and how important is it for the Mets to, especially considering that they're probably going to have a fire sale if they don't get going, pretty soon, to start playing better this weekend against Philadelphia?
Well, it's really important, Mark. I mean, obviously they've dug themselves a couple of holes and gotten themselves out of it, and you just wonder how many more times they can do that, especially given the problems they've had, which you just touched on. Whether Pagan can come back this weekend. But then yesterday in the game, R.A. Dickey went down with like a foot or a heel injury. So their pitching staff is already really, really thin, and they cannot afford to lose he or any other starting pitcher for any length of time. So really, in terms of for this year, it's looking more and more bleak, just because realistically, where are they going to be able to get the wins from when the pitching staff is the way that it looks, and and the offense is really not built to carry the team. So they've got a huge homestand coming up in terms of just keeping this season alive. They've proven us wrong before when we thought we were ready to write them off after they were 5-13. So who knows? They can do it again. But it's going to become more and more difficult for them to do it the later we get into the season, and the fact that they just can't seem to stay healthy. That's the other issue that doesn't seem to be going away. So that's kind of where they stand right now. They've this bit of news yesterday with the David Einhorn news was pretty much the first good news they've gotten in quite some time, and we'll see if that can lead to other things. But on the field, they still have the same concerns that they did even before Einhorn gave up his $200 million.
All right, check out the post for coverage this weekend of Mets-Phillies series. I want to thank Dan. And for the New York Post, I'm Mark Hale from Southern Hospitality.